Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel once again. Today we have the case of Julian Kepke. This time, I didn't want to focus so much on massacres or things like that, because they really are horrible, but on something more hopeful, we could say. Hopeful, obviously, within all the things this girl had to live through. But enough! I'm going to stop talking, and let's start with the story of October 1954 in the city of Lima, the capital of Peru, but she has German ancestry. Her parents were German biologists who made significant contributions to scientific work in Peru. So we're going to start the story by talking a little about them and about the work they did in the Peruvian jungle, as that would later be key to the events that marked Julian's life later on. Julian's father, Hans Wilhelm Kepke, was a German biologist who, after studying at the University of Kiel, where he obtained a doctorate in natural sciences in 1947, had a great interest in conducting research in the jungle. So, with no greater resource than his knowledge, he boarded a salt freighter and arrived in South America as a stowaway, crossing the continent on foot until he reached Peru, where after going through some jobs, he began to work at the Javier Prado Natural History Museum in Lima. Eventually, his girlfriend, Maria Emily Ann von Mikulicz-Radecki, whom he met at the university, also went to Peru and they got married. So at that time, she was known by the simple name of Maria Kepke. Maria, Julian's mother, also had a doctorate from the University of Kiel, in this case in zoology, and she stood out for being an excellent student. At 26 years old, she traveled to Peru to meet the love of her life, with whom she shared the same passion, the scientific research of the wildlife. Once in Peru, together they were able to start different expeditions to the jungle, and finally, as a result of their union, they had their daughter, Julian. Precisely, Julian did not have a conventional childhood. As being the daughter of two such passionate biologists, she spent much of her childhood in the Peruvian jungle, living in cabins that her parents set up for their observations. And from a very early age, she had an approach with the fauna of the area, and even took care of a small toucan. Of course, as she grew up, Julian was sent to complete her secondary studies at the Peruvian-German Alexander von Humboldt School, located in Lima. But every time she returned to the jungle, she truly felt at home. Gradually, her parents' research progressed, so much so that in 1968, when Julian was already 14 years old, they managed to establish the Panguana Biological Research Station, whose objective was to study the biodiversity of the flora and fauna of the area, in addition to protecting and preserving this ecosystem. It is an area of about 13 square kilometers located in the low jungle of Peru, in the province of Puerto Inca, in the Huánuco region. They named it Panguana, in honor of a species of partridge characteristic of the region, and you can only reach this station by boat and on foot, as it is located 260 meters above the Chuchapichis River, a tributary of the Pachatia River. We are seeing all this because you should know that even though Julian studied high school in Lima, she traveled to the Panguana station whenever she could to be with her parents, and what they did was take a bus, or a plane from Lima to the city of Pucallpa. From there, they embarked on a journey, partly by boat, partly on foot, to reach Panguana. They did so frequently, without any major problem, until the day everything changed forever. It was December 24th, 1971, and Julian Kepke was already 17 years old and had successfully completed his secondary studies, which meant that he could now return to the jungle with his parents to spend the December holidays together. But before traveling, Julian wanted to attend his graduation party scheduled for the 23rd of December. So he and his mother decided to travel on the same 24th day of Christmas Eve to the city of Pucallpa, where they would meet his father to celebrate Christmas. For this, they bought 2 plane tickets from the company Líneas Aéreas Nacionales Sociedad Anónima, known as LANSA, a Peruvian airline that at the time of the events only had 1 plane that made 2 consecutive national routes a day. This was a Lockheed L-188A Electra, which usually flew from Lima to Cusco round trip, but due to repairs there were long delays. So just on the day when Julian and Maria decided to travel, there was only 1 flight available from Lima to Iquitos, with a stopover in Pucallpa. As you can imagine, it's not that they had any other option to choose or think about it a little more, or even look at what plane they were going to get on, because it was December 24th they had decided to travel on that date, and therefore there were no other options. Everything was full. Anyway, with this decision, and having the tickets, it seemed that everything would go perfectly. Their plans to spend the holidays with family were on track. A total of 92 people, including crew and passengers, were happy to know that they were going to reunite with their loved ones in a few hours. They carried gifts, sweets, and some panettones, which it should be clarified. The latter is a sweet bread of Italian origin that is traditionally consumed by Peruvians on Christmas Eve. It could be said that everyone was ready, everyone hoping that this trip would not have any problems. That's how they boarded the plane for Flight 508 of LANSA at Jorge Chávez International Airport in Lima. They would make a stop in Pucallpa, and their final destination would be Iquitos. Julian took his seat in row 19, seat F, next to the window. His mother was traveling next to him in the middle seat. The first 25 minutes of the flight went by normally. They served a sandwich to all the passengers as part of the snack, and suddenly Julian, in this normality that occurred on the plane, decided to look out the window and noticed that they had entered a zone of dark clouds. The truth is that this didn't worry her too much because she was used to flying and she liked the experience. But a storm started and her mother became a bit uneasy. Little by little, all the passengers began to see how the plane was entering this storm. Strong turbulence began. The clouds hit the plane with such force that they seemed like animals. Everything darkened. The lightning fell incessantly, and the Christmas gifts that the passengers had stored in their compartments began to fall everywhere. The daylight turns into night, and the lightning flashes in all directions. People are left breathless as the plane shakes violently. Bags, wrapped gifts, and clothes fall from the overhead compartments. Sandwich trays fly through the air, and half-finished drinks spill over the passengers' heads. People are screaming and crying. Instantly, around 12:36 in the afternoon, Julian manages to see a very strident white light falling on the right wing. Everything seemed to indicate that a lightning bolt had hit one of the aircraft's engines, and Julian could only hear his mother's voice saying, "This is the end." They held hands tightly, waiting. That's how they began to plummet. Among the chaos and despair from one moment to the next, Julian was out of the plane, and his hand was no longer holding his mother's. He was in the air, alone, falling along with his seat head down. The belt was tightening his stomach. He couldn't breathe, and he saw how he was approaching this green vastness. She describes a green like broccoli. This was the jungle that, while they were flying, they had below. And although she could observe her surroundings, she didn't have time to be scared because she immediately fainted. We would later learn that Julian had fallen from a height of 3,000 meters, that the plane had broken into several pieces, and that she would be the only survivor of a tragic plane crash that claimed the lives of absolutely everyone else who was with her on LANSA Flight 508. Julian had survived, but she didn't know it yet. In her unconscious state, she would later recount that she had 2 dreams that she remembers clearly before waking up. In the first one, she was flying at full speed through a dark place next to a wall and heard a thunderous buzzing, as if a motor was in her head. And in the other dream, she was dirty, felt sticky, and was covered in mud. so she needed to bathe immediately. So in her dreams, she thought, "It's easy, you just have to get up and go to the bathtub." So when she made the decision to do it in this dream, is when she woke up and found herself under her seat, completely soaked and covered in mud. Right there. That's the moment when Julian realizes she had fallen from the plane and that she was alive. She was on the ground, in the middle of the jungle, and she had a hard time getting up because she had suffered a severe concussion. But when she looked around, she realized she was completely alone. Her mom, who was traveling with her, had disappeared, just like everyone else who was on the plane. She felt completely abandoned, but soon she began to analyze her body. She realized that she could hardly see because her left eye was completely closed due to swelling, and her right eye had only a small slit through which she could look. She had also lost her glasses, only she was wearing one sandal and was dressed in a short, light dress that was in fashion at that time. She made a first attempt to get up, but she couldn't stand up, so she decided to stay lying on the ground for a while longer, until she managed to stand up on a second attempt. She checked her body, now much calmer, and realized that she had broken her collarbone, because one bone was on top of the other, but it was not an open fracture, and she also had a deep cut in her left calf and a cut on her right arm, which over the days would start to fill with worms. At that moment, she didn't see anything else, so she started looking for her mom everywhere, but she couldn't find her. Soon, Julian knew that he had to survive, and his parents had given him the greatest gift to be able to do so, which was knowledge. To begin with, Julian managed to identify the croaking of the frogs and the songs of the birds around him, and realized that he was in the same jungle that his parents studied. So he decided to move forward with the aim of finding help. She started walking through the jungle day and night, and on the fourth day, she came across something that left her astonished. She found a plain seat with 3 deceased people in it. The seat was buried a meter into the ground, so it must have fallen like a bullet through the jungle, and the people lost their lives immediately. One of those bodies was a woman's, and even though he knew it was impossible for it to be his mother, since Maria was traveling with her, Julian gathered his courage and with a branch slowly turned one of her feet and saw that the woman had painted nails, confirming that it was not his mother, as she never painted hers. Deep down, he had the hope of finding her, but in the end, that was the only contact he had with the people from the plane. The only things he could salvage from that place were a bag of candies and a panettone, which he had to leave behind, because when he ate it, he realized it was full of mud. At that moment, he also realized something. She started paying attention to a noise that had been accompanying her every day, but she never listened to it carefully. It was the sound of water. Julian discovered a small stream, and in his own words, that was the moment he knew clearly that to get out of the jungle, he had to follow the course of the water. He knew that the course of that stream would lead to a larger course that would bring him help. So he began to follow it until he reached the Yambonia River, characterized by being surrounded by wild cane. But he immediately realized that this river was not navigable and that he would not find anyone there. At the same time, he realized that the planes and helicopters he constantly saw in the sky gradually stopped appearing. What was happening was that she saw them and tried many times to get their attention, but it was impossible. The dense vegetation of the jungle kept her hidden, just like the remains of the plane that couldn't be found from the air. By this point, the wound on her arm was her biggest concern because it was full of fly eggs, and the larvae, which were already a centimeter long, had eaten away at her arm, leaving a hole the size of a coin. Julian traveled down the Yambonia River, mostly swimming or letting the current carry him. The place was full of crocodiles, grouped in 2s or 3s, and when they saw her approaching, they would dive into the water. But Julian did nothing. He just kept floating because his parents had taught him at Panguana Station that crocodiles were not a great danger, but that stingrays, a kind of river ray with a poisonous sting, were much more dangerous, and if one had stung him, he would not have lived to tell the tale. Another detail that should also be mentioned is that Julian made this entire journey clinging to the only sandal he had left. He used it precisely to take firm steps, trying not to encounter one of the aforementioned creatures. The weather was also an important factor for Julian. It often rained all night, and even though he tried to protect himself with large leaves, they were of no use because he felt the icy raindrops piercing his skin like needles. And when it wasn't raining, the mosquitoes were the real hell. She continued her journey for a total of 10 days, completely weakened and with an increasing apathy. She only fed on the candies she found because she preferred to stay away from the fruits she didn't know. Until that night, on the 10th, she found a sandbank and decided to rest on it. She looked around in the hope of finding some trace of human contact, but apparently, due to fatigue, she didn't notice something that had been there since she arrived in that area, and that she could only see a boat. At first, she thought she was hallucinating, but she slowly approached, touched the boat, and realized it was real. She looked around to see if the owners were there, but she didn't see anyone. Instead, on one side of the river, she discovered a small path that she had not seen before falling asleep. This led to a small hut that was apparently used as a temporary stay by some local fishermen. It had a small roof, and under it was an engine covered by a plastic tarp and a can of fuel. Immediately, she remembered something her father had done. Once he used a bit of fuel to disinfect a wound on a dog they had. So she decided to pour a little on the wound she had on her arm, which was still there at that moment. Covered in eggs, the pain was intense because the worms were trying to burrow deeper into the wound. I pulled out about 30 worms and felt very proud of myself. I decided to spend the night there. Julian decided to stay in that place for the night, and during the course, his hunger was such that he spent hours trying to catch some frogs that were around him. She knew they were poisonous, but she didn't care. She knew their poison wasn't lethal. But if she had managed to eat any in her state, it could have been fatal. The next morning, January 3rd of 1976, Julian heard some voices coming from the jungle. It was a man named Marcio Rivera, along with 2 other loggers who were working on the Yavonia River. When they first saw her, the men were stunned because they thought Julian was a spirit of the jungle, a figure from a local legend, known to be a kind of mermaid, a hybrid between a dolphin and a blonde woman with white skin. Let's remember that all this happens in the middle of the jungle, and it happened that Julian's eyes were so inflamed that this, added to her blonde hair, alarmed the locals. But a key factor that made the difference was that, despite her German ancestry, Julian was Peruvian and knew how to speak Spanish. So she told them, "I was in the Lanza plane crash. My name is Julian." Obviously, the men quickly got her on the boat and sailed for 11 hours to reach the nearest town on the Pachatea River. From there, she was taken to the missionary hospital in Pucallpa, where she was finally able to reunite with her father, who incredulously hugged her, because no one could believe that the young woman had managed to survive an accident of such magnitude. And not only that, but Julian had spent 10 days in the jungle, alone. She had managed to survive, and now she was finally safe. It seemed more like a dream. Once Julian was more stable, he was able to give his testimony to the authorities. And thanks to that, they were able to find the remains of the ship and some of the bodies of the victims of this event. That's how they were able to verify the crash. However, none could overcome their injuries, and they were losing their lives for different reasons. Dr. Juan Saplana Ramirez, who was in charge of directing the search command for the accident victims, narrates that reaching the scene of the disaster was dramatic and chilling, as the first thing they saw, in addition to the remains of the plane, were trees full of the passengers' belongings, open suitcases, and gifts hanging from the branches, as if it were, in his own words, a sad and fateful Christmas tree for those people who could never reunite with their loved ones. In Pucallpa, more than 60 victims of the accident are buried, whose remains could be recovered from the jungle, and in the place where their bodies lie, you can read the warmth of the sacred home. In the Christmas of 1000, the warmth of the sacred home. In the Christmas of 1971, we wanted to reach him, and instead, we reached eternal darkness. Regarding the Lanza airline, on January 4th of 1972, the day after finding Julian Kepke, the government of Peru revoked the airline's operating certificate, which, by the way, had already ceased all its operations after this accident, because in it they lost their last available plane. All the other planes had already been retired from service. They had also been lost in accidents or had become inoperable. Lanza had a terrible reputation. Even a year before this tragedy, on August 9th, 1970, another accident occurred, this time with a Lockheed L-1 188 Electra operating flight 502 that left the city of Cusco heading to Lima. But when trying to take off, there was a failure in engine number 3, and the captain of the ship, far from aborting the takeoff, went ahead, did not manage to maintain the necessary speed for takeoff, worsened the situation with a bad maneuver. The plane lost lift and finally crashed into the ground in the San Geronimo sector. A total of 101 people lost their lives, 99 people who were traveling on the plane, and 2 farmers who were at the site at the time of impact. There was only one survivor, who was the co-pilot of the aircraft, who got out of the plane on his own, with multiple burns. All this without mentioning the first of his accidents, which occurred in April of '66, where the lives of the 49 people on board were lost. In the documentary Wings of Hope, so named for being the phrase that can be read on the memorial monument to the victims, directed by the German Werner Herzog in 1998, it is revealed that after the previous accident, Flight 502 that occurred in Cusco, they discovered that the people in charge of inspecting the plane's engine had actually been motorcycle mechanics, and that apparently the pilots did not have a license to fly, and nobody did anything about it. In other words, there was not a single thing in order on that plane, and they thought it was going to be able to take off properly. 3 tragedies had to occur before all their certificates were finally revoked and their opportunity to fly. Once Julian Kepke fully recovered, he returned to Germany with his father, where he decided to study biology and zoology at the University of Kiel, and then earned a doctorate at the University of Munich. Julian married Erich Diller, a biologist like her, so her last name changed, and she is currently known as Dr. Julian Diller, who specialized in mammalogy. In her case, she specialized mainly in the study of bats. Of course, she would never forget the jungle where she grew up with her parents, the same one where she had to fight for her life at her young age of 17. So since the year 2000, she took charge of the Panguana station, managing to have it declared a private conservation area by the Ministry of the Environment of Peru at the end of 2011, and now it is permanently protected against deforestation, hunting, and illegal mining. Currently, Dr. Julian Diller serves as a librarian in the zoological collection of the state of Bavaria, located in Munich, Germany, the same one that since the year 2003 has had a scientific cooperation with the Museum of Natural History of the National University of San Marcos in Lima, Peru. In charge of Panguana when she is not in the country, even in charge when she is not in the country, even in the year 2019, Julian Kepke, as she is still known in Peru, was decorated with the Order of Merit for distinguished services in the rank of Grand Officer in recognition of her outstanding academic and scientific career. Her important contributions to biology and her recognized research on the flora and fauna of the Peruvian Amazon, in addition to having contributed to the improvement of the quality of life of the Ayaninka communities that live in the area where Panguana is located. And finally, the question that many asked when the accident occurred: how was Julian Kepke able to survive a fall of 3,000 meters in the middle of the jungle? Julian has asked herself this question on several occasions, and now that she has all the scientific studies and foundations to get an answer, she has proposed 3 possible explanations. The first talks about upward forces in storm clouds. She indicates that sometimes, in very large cloud accumulations, dramatic winds are generated that forcefully carry everything upwards, so it is possible that this reduced the speed of her fall. The second would be to spiral during the fall. Julian fell from the plane attached to her row of seats because she correctly fastened her seatbelt. She explains that during the brief time she was conscious while falling through the air, she remembers seeing the jungle spinning like a top beneath her, which probably means she fell like a maple seed, which, if you haven't seen, spin like helicopters in the air, making their fall much slower. The third has to do with the tall trees intertwined with vines that could have cushioned the fall. The search command that found the seat in which Julian had traveled told her that when they arrived in the area, the trees were covered and united by a very dense network of vines, which probably softened the impact of her fall. So it could be any of these options, or it could be all three together. Obviously, this is not a story that happens every day, not only because of the magnitude of the tragic accident, but because Julian survived a fall of more than 3,000 meters, and besides, despite having lost her mother, being alone and in a quite weakened physical and mental state, she survived 10 days in the middle of the jungle, actively seeking rescue. So this story was quickly brought to the big screen with the movie Miracles Still Happen, directed by Giuseppe Maria Scotese, and released in 1974. Production with which, by the way, Julian does not agree so much because they show her facing crocodiles, jaguars, and all kinds of dangerous creatures, when what she lived, although they were hard things, they were also very different due to the knowledge she had obtained from her parents. In 2011, Julian published a book called When I Fell from the Sky, where she tells in her own words everything she experienced in the jungle. We also mentioned before the documentary Wings of Hope from 1998, where Julian travels with her husband and the director of the film to the area where the plane crashed, where they also managed to find some debris in parts of it. And Julian goes on to tell each of her experiences in this way. It's on YouTube if you want to watch it. As an additional fact, a month before the filming of this documentary, Marcio Rivera, one of the men who found Julian, went to look for remains of the boat where he found her to show them to her, but he almost lost his life because he accidentally stepped on a river stingray. He spent a total of 3 days on the brink of death on a sandbank, until a boat passed by that didn't want to pick him up because he didn't have money to pay them, so in exchange, he gave them his shotgun. When they started filming the documentary, Julian sought out the man who had the gun, bought it from him, and returned it to Marcio. And that's how we come to the end of the story. Such was the case with Julian Kepke. Here are the Patreons and channel members. Thank you for supporting me through these means. Back to those who celebrate it, Merry Christmas. And with nothing else to say, here's a new video, here's a recommended video. You can subscribe by clicking on my face, and we'll see each other in another video.